Good afternoon, class. This is Professor Key, and the title of this lecture is Exploring All Sides of an Event in History. And this is for freshman U.S. History 101. The learning objective for this course is to determine whether the commander of Fort Gaines down at Dauphin Island, Alabama, was justified in surrendering his position after the Battle of Mobile Bay. So the biblical learning objective is to appreciate Proverbs 18:17. And that proverb states, every man's story seems right until the other comes and examines him. So consider that proverb as we go through this 15-minute lecture on the Battle of Mobile Bay and the surrender of Fort Gaines. Now this lecture is going to build on our previous studies. For the last few weeks we've been studying why the Civil War came about, why some Northerners fought, why Southerners fought, the internal divisions within the North and the South, some of the political, economic, and military factors that led to the war. And we have studied some of the major turning points, some of the big battles and decisions up to 1864. So here we are in 1864 when this battle, the Battle of Mobile Bay, takes place. So the way I'll tell you this story of the Battle of Mobile Bay is to give you a brief history on Mobile and Mobile Bay, why it had such a strategic importance and why the Union needed to take it in 1864. And secondly, I'll give you a little overview of the battle. And thirdly, the meat of the story is how Colonel Anderson came to be labeled as a coward for surrendering his position in Fort Gaines. And how only one side of the party controlled the narrative and the newspapers and the accounts that went out to the public. And it was 3 weeks later when Anderson was finally able to get his own side of the story out, where the public's view of him and his decision changed, along with history's view of him and his decision. So it really hammers home Proverbs 18:17. So in a moment, I'll project a map of Mobile Bay in 1864 and the forts that were protecting the bay, and I'll kind of guide you through the history of the bay, its strategic importance, and the battle. So here's your map of Mobile Bay, and north is up. And Mobile in 1864 was one of the last two remaining open ports in the Confederacy. So a lot of the supplies were coming in and out of the Confederacy through Mobile. So the Union knew they had to plug that last hole in their blockade as part of the Anaconda Plan in order to help starve out the South. And a secondary goal of attacking Mobile Bay was to draw Confederate troops to defend Mobile in order that General Sherman would have less Confederate troops to fight up in Atlanta to help him attack Atlanta. So the defenses of Mobile Bay, you can see down on the south side of the bay, there's a peninsula extending from east to west, and at the tip of that peninsula is Fort Morgan. And then there's the entrance to the bay right there in the middle on the south, and on the other side of the entrance is Fort Gaines. That's on Dauphin Island on the west side of the bay. So in order to secure sea power into the bay, the Union fleet under Admiral Farragut has to charge through that gauntlet between those two forts under heavy fire in order to get into the bay. On August 5th, 1864, Admiral Farragut runs this gauntlet, and he gets inside the bay, so gains sea power. And the next phase of the operation is to lay siege to both of these two forts and capitulate them. So the first fort that the Army contingent lays siege to is Fort Gaines, there on the island. And the fort was not completely finished by the time the siege started, by the time the Civil War came about, and it was poorly manned, poorly gunned. It was actually at a lower elevation than some of the sand dunes surrounding it. So when the Union infantry and artillery came to lay siege to the fort, they could actually aim down into the fort from these higher dunes on the west side. And 2 days after the siege began on August 7th, Colonel Anderson got a petition from his officers, including the Marine officers, saying, "We believe this position's untenable. We should surrender and perhaps live to fight another day." Anderson weighed his options and surrendered the fort. Now, this was in direct uh, opposition to his orders from General Page. General Page, his superior officer, was in Fort Morgan across the bay, defending Fort Morgan. And General Page had told Anderson, defend at all costs. When General Page heard that Anderson had surrendered, Page was furious. Now, the narrative of the surrender of Fort Gaines was controlled by General Page throughout the South, because Anderson, as soon as he surrendered, went to a POW camp in New Orleans, and so his voice was silenced. He could not get out his side of the story. He went straight from Gaines to a POW camp. So General Page, who was furious at Gaines, spread the news through the South that Fort Gaines had been shamefully surrendered. Anderson was a coward. He should be court-martialed upon his release. And that is the narrative that took root in Southern newspapers, Northern newspapers, and newspapers as far away as England. So General Page was able to hold out for another 4 weeks under siege, and he was in direct comms with Mobile, who was in comms with the rest of the South. So he controlled the narrative of how Colonel Anderson surrendered. And so all information, the source of it, is coming from General Page. So here's the initial information coming from the Camden Daily, a South Carolina newspaper that tells us about the surrender. Mobile, August 8th. We are pained to announce that Fort Gaines was surrendered at 9:30 this morning by its commander, Colonel Charles Anderson of the 21st Alabama. The fort was provisioned for 6 months and had a garrison of 600 men. And then I'll skip a little bit. Down at the bottom it says, Fort Morgan signaled Fort Gaines this morning but received no answer except from Yankee officers on the ramparts. Anderson's conduct is officially denounced as inexplicable and shameful. And all of the newspapers were getting their information from the same root source, General Page. And as far away as London, England, in the London Examiner, the title of the foreign section for the American Civil War is Shameful Surrender to the Federals of Fort Gaines. Now, 4 weeks later, after Anderson surrendered, General Page has to surrender his position as well. It was just a fruitless enterprise to try to withstand the siege from 3 sides on this peninsula. And so General Page surrenders, and that's when the truth starts to come to light, not only about Anderson's decision to surrender his fort, but also about the character of General Page. When one surrenders their position during the Civil War, the honorable and expected thing to do is, once the negotiations are complete, you leave the surrendered position, Fort Morgan in this case, as is. So you're not dumping gunpowder down wells, you're not destroying flour supplies, you're not spiking cannons. Page did these things. When he went to surrender to General Granger, who was in charge of the land forces, the Union land forces, Page spiked the cannons in Fort Morgan, generally made a mess of the place, and even refused to deliver up his sword and surrendered. He and the other officers had broken their swords over their knees and refused to surrender honorably. And so that's when the story starts to flip, right? Proverbs 18:17. Now the other's coming to examine the first story. And so we have new newspaper articles coming out with a different tone. And here's a newspaper article that accounts for General Page's surrender. It says, the surrender of Fort Morgan, dishonorable conduct of General Page, guns spiked after the surrender. And it goes on to explain how Page came out without a sword. His officers didn't have swords. They found them later broken inside the fort. So the story starts to unfold. And right about this same time, Colonel Anderson is able to publish his side of the story from his POW camp in New Orleans. He sends a letter to his wife explaining why he surrendered, trying to save his name. He knows these things are being said about him, but he also gives a copy of that letter to a local newspaper. And in that letter, he explains that he was in a hopeless position. All of his cannons were disabled. Federal troops were closing in on him from three sides from an elevated position. And he figured he could serve no more purpose in protecting either Mobile or uh, Fort Morgan. And so he surrendered in order to save his men from a senseless death. So that wraps up the story and it really brings to light Proverbs 18:17. See, you need to explore all sides of an event as a historian. So your assignment for this lesson, exploring all aspects and all accounts of an event, is to find 5 sources on an event in the Civil War and note the differences in how those sources portray the event. Those sources can be both primary and secondary sources. So 5 sources that portray the event and explain the differences, either in how the author of the source highlights certain aspects and disregards others, what he finds important, what he does not, and what he thinks the lasting impacts of that event are.